Welcome back to the Jessica Ash Wellness YouTube channel, coming to you with another episode of the Fully Nourished Podcast, a place to explore where female physiology and feminine energy dance together to shape our life experience. I'm Jessica Ash, a functional nutritionist and integrative health coach, and you'll find that this podcast is really about taking both a scientific and a spiritual look at why we as women have become so completely burned out, almost on a soul level and a cell level, and the real physiological consequences to that burnout. I want to explore together what it looks like to reclaim our feminine radiance and become deeply and fully nourished. With that being said, as a reminder, everything in this podcast is for education and inspiration only and is not intended as medical advice. Please talk to the appropriate professional if necessary, and please use common sense before making any changes to your diet or lifestyle. So in today's episode, we're continuing our Heresy Heals series. And I know that for some of you, it's been pretty scandalous, but I am so encouraged by the many messages that I've gotten in the DMs and in the feedback form in the show notes. So I'm going to keep going. And I appreciate you being really patient with me last week. I know I skipped last week's episode. I was actually gone. I went to the Matriarch Rising Festival with the Free Birth Society, which was a really fun time. And for those of you listening that I got to meet in person, it was so lovely to meet every single one of you. And it was just such a great time to be around so many women. Definitely a varied group of women. So really interesting to be around such a variety. But at the root and core of it, being around other women is so just medicinal almost, because it's very rare that you actually are able to gather and be around so many other women. It's so cool. So if I sound like I'm losing my voice a little bit today, it's because I am. And if I sound tired, it's because I am. But totally worth it. But as we continue this series, this week's is going to be really talking about why getting into your feminine energy can feel impossible or almost is impossible. And I'm going to be introducing you to the nourishing practice of energetic equilibrium. We're going to talk about why so many women are stressed out by the idea of getting into our feminine energy and some better ways to look at it. We'll touch on some ways that the divine feminine space is really almost infiltrated, I guess we could use the word, or that's not the best word, but infiltrated with a lot of lies and deceptions, and it can actually end up leading you down a really dark path or a path that doesn't feel right, and so we'll hit on that. We'll also talk about how getting into our feminine energy is really actually about integration and integrating our masculine and feminine within ourselves. And then we're also going to talk about some actionable steps. What does it look like to begin this process on a very actionable, very real, very physical level, not this kind of esoteric level? I know a lot of you have been asking me for like action steps. And so I think when we have these discussions about feminine energy, it's really important to talk also about what does this look like in action? What does this look like practically? Because I think a lot of us are resonating with the message, but we're stumbling forward. Like, what do we do about it? So that's what we're going to hit on today. And before we go any further, I think it's important for me to highlight what I mean by heresy. So you'll find a lot that I'm very particular about the words I use. And I've mentioned this in episodes past that I am a big believer that all words are spells. So the words we speak over ourselves, our thoughts, the words that we use within our thoughts, and even the words we use when we write things down, it really makes a big difference because words have more than just meaning and definitions. They carry energy with them. They carry a vibration with them. And if we're not aware of this, words can very much be used to control us. Words can have a lot of power over us and almost put us in these like trance-like states. If we're being honest, I'm sure many of you listening have experienced this where you'll have a conversation with someone and they'll just keep repeating the same phrasing or the same words over and over again. And you're like, you're not answering my question. That's not what I said. But it's almost like they're hitting a wall within their own mind or their own programming, and they can't go around that. And so when I am seeking truth, and this can apply to spiritual truths. This can apply to physical truths, like in the wellness space. It's really important to have a understanding of what a word means and to not skip over something if we don't understand. A lot of times we'll read big words, or we'll read words that we maybe don't completely grasp the meaning of, and we'll just skip over it and just assume that we know what is being talked about or what is being said. And this is, in my opinion, can be a really dangerous practice. And it's really important to understand the words that we use and what they mean. A simple example of this is when children are always asking why. When children are at a young age, they're always asking why, or what does that mean, or what, or why. They're always asking those questions. And I think that is a practice that we should carry throughout our whole life, but we often stop at some point and we forget to ask why, and we forget to ask, what does that mean? And we just learn to almost just go with what the group is doing, or just go with the flow and just assume that somebody somewhere higher up than us is asking these questions. So I'm a big fan of using etymology, which is the study of words, the study of the origins of words. One of my favorite websites ever is etymonline.com, like etymology online. And it is so much fun to look at the roots of words, the Latin roots or the origins of certain words, because they can sometimes go back all the way to the Sanskrit. And when you can grasp the true meaning or the true origins of a word, it really can change your perspective or your perception of specific things. And I do this when I'm studying scriptures. I'm always going to back to the root word and really looking at the phrasing. I also do it a lot when I'm reading older texts. I really love reading books, health books and philosophy books and even occult books. Oh my gosh, you said occult. Look that up. From like the 1800s and the early 1900s. And the words that were used back then were just different. The vocabulary that was used was much more expansive and it really challenged the mind. And so I do that when I'm studying research, when I'm looking at research papers or research studies. Don't skip over the things that you don't understand because you don't comprehend them. Just increase your reading comprehension by sitting there with a dictionary or a tab open with the dictionary and just Googling really quickly, what does this mean? And then rephrasing the sentence for yourself so you really understand it. You don't have to be a scholar to do that. Anybody can do that. It just takes the time, right, and the effort and the energy. And I do the same thing with words. So we're going to look at the etymology of two specific words in this episode, and the first one is going to be heresy. I think when we think of heresy, we don't really maybe grasp what it means, or we are familiar with the word heretic, but we don't necessarily know what that means. And when you look at the Latin and the Greek roots of heresy, the Latin refers to heresis, or the root word of heresy, as a school of thought or a philosophical sect. And then the Latin word is pulled from the Greek, heresis, and that is really a taking or a choosing for oneself, a choice, a means of taking, a deliberate plan or purpose, a philosophical sect or school. And then it also derives from another word that means take or seize or to choose. And so in my mind, the meaning for me is really this idea of choosing a different path, to make a choice. And that can be a difficult choice to make, especially when we are in a culture that really is about just following the crowd. The word that almost comes to mind is like whoever can have the most sensational message. Like we want sensation within our body. And if a message does not give us sensations of a thrill almost, then it's not worth our time. And so unfortunately, you see this a lot happening in the wellness space, but also very often you see this in religious spaces, whether that be like the New Age religion or a Christian religion or whatever it might be. You really see this very extremist black and white approach to everything where somebody needs to be sticking to extremes. There's almost like a underlying tone of dysregulation behind it, because when there's mental inflexibility, and what that comes down to is actually women are not properly resourced from within. This comes down to nourishment. This comes down to mineralization. This comes down to being well rested. This comes down to internal belief systems, what you believe about yourself and the world around you. and we'll talk about this a little bit more, but when a woman is not properly rooted or anchored from within, is not properly resourced from within, it's almost as if you're a shell that gets swayed back and forth by the wind. And you just flip flop all around, a slave to your own emotions and your own feelings and your own fears, and also an inability to see nuance, a blindness to nuance, a blindness to this. Let's look at this a little bit further, right? It's almost an addiction or an automatic reactionary response instead of a responsive response, right? A resilient response where you take something in and it doesn't like pierce you to your very soul. You just take it in slowly and you sit with it a little bit. You like taste it, you swish it around in your mouth a little bit, and you can spit it back out instead of just swallowing everything that you come in contact with. And so this is why I think it's so important to view truth as a living and breathing thing. I have had discussions with women where they'll tell me that what I teach really scares them or really makes them afraid because they believe that truth is absolute. And I would actually agree with them. However, where I differ in opinion is that truth is like a diamond, right? We don't have the ability to see the whole diamond because as humans, we do not have the capacity for it. But each one of us is looking at a facet of the diamond and saying, I see truth. And another person saying, I see truth, and this truth looks different, right? It's not about saying, this is my truth and this is your truth, but it's what is true, and then breaking down, how are you seeing it? Oh, that's really interesting. And I can see how you can see it that way based on your experience and based on what you have been exposed to, and vice versa. And this is how humans are supposed to expand. This is how we actually expand our minds and grow in what is often called consciousness. And it's interesting to see how throughout many different scriptures, I've read like the ancient Persian scriptures, a lot of like ancient Egyptian teachings. I've read, of course, the Old Testament and New Testament scriptures, even the ones that are not included in the modern canon, and many different philosophical teachings as well, Hermeticism and things like that. And it's fascinating to me how truth is always referred to not in an it form, like not referred to as a thing to be possessed, but almost as a person. And it's always referred to as a she. Sometimes you'll see it referred to in the neutral form, rarely, but you'll often see that the spirit of truth is referred to as a she. You see this happen in Proverbs where it defines wisdom and knowledge and understanding as a she. You also see this in the New Testament when the spirit of truth is described. In the ancient Persian scriptures or the Zoroastrian scriptures, truth referred to as a spirit called Asha. Or you see in some of the more mystical teachings, like the Gnostics would refer to wisdom as Sophia. And this honestly makes complete sense to me because as we continue to deep dive into the feminine and expand our knowledge on the feminine energy, the feminine is much more expansive in nature. It's vast, but it's also safe. It's also loving. It's also guiding. It's also nurturing. It wants to be sought, similar to the feminine, right? The feminine is a receiver and the masculine is a giver. And so it's interesting to me how truth almost demands to be sought, and then it will come and like envelop you and inspire you with its beauty. And so we have to recognize that truth in and of itself is infinite. And because we are finite beings, we can never handle what the whole truth is. And it's important for us to recognize this and be humble enough to admit it. But on the flip side, we'll never regret seeking after it. And this is why I am a big believer that as women restore their energy production, they restore their metabolism, they begin to nourish more, and they start to regain the mental flexibility that is their natural state, we really, as women, begin to use our mind to see things that we did not see before, right? Because now we have the capacity to expand. This is one of my pillars of feminine energetics, which I call feminine capacity. We have an infinite ability to expand but we need to be properly resourced to do. And so I think where a lot of women are struggling right now, I noticed this in the wellness space, and this is why I took a big step back and really dove into these teachings and really started to wrestle with a lot of what I found, a lot of the truths I found hidden within female physiology. And the biggest thing that drove this work, the biggest thing that inspired me was I was just noticing how so many of my female followers and students were hungry for more. It was like they were nourishing and the nourishment was opening up their eyes. They were more connected to their body than ever before. And their body started talking to them. Their nervous system started to say, this doesn't feel right. There's something deep within me that does not feel right. What I believe about myself does not feel right. What I believe about my creator does not feel right. It starts to make them feel extremely unsafe in their bodies. But because it's so scary and it requires this expansion, it requires them to get outside of a box or create a bigger box. It's terrifying. And so they remain inside this box. And what I've noticed, and this is pretty much the prevalent problem right now within the wellness space, is they just keep trying to solve their problems with the same size box. And it's absolutely suffocating them. When in reality, what's actually being asked of them is to break open the box that they've been trapped in and expand it into something bigger. And so they put on weight, right? Like we as women will put on weight because we feel unsafe. We will start to have nervous system dysregulation. We'll start to have anxiety. And because we're so scared, we start to just blame the physical. It's what are the mineral imbalances? What are the this? What are the that? The mold, the this, the that. And you can probably see this in the wellness space right now where like women just are constantly chasing new things to try, new things to pathologize, new things to be afraid of, new things to blame for all of their health issues because they are afraid to shift. And so what this ends up feeling is that you're on a never-ending roller coaster of not knowing what to believe, not knowing what is true. It feels like everything that you're learning is contradicting something that you've already learned. Like you literally see two polar opposites and you're trying to reckon this person believes this and this person believes this, and they appear to be both opposites. So what do I believe? And when you do start to regain the mental flexibility and you start to create safety within your own system, you can begin to see what are two universal laws. There are 7 universal laws of nature. They're actually beyond just the laws of nature, they're the laws of the universe. This is based on the Hermetic principles. And 2 of these universal laws are the law of polarity and the law of correspondence. When you're in a base state of survival, so when you're in this idea of you're constantly in a state of desperation, you're constantly in a state of survival, you're trapped in a certain area of your body. You are out of control of your mind. A lot of people think that their mind is going, but that's actually not true. Your mind is being clouded. Your perception is being clouded by hormonal reactions of survival within your system. We are often referred to these as fight, flight, freeze, fawn, collapse, fright is sometimes often used, but whatever we're referring to, nervous system dysregulation, it really comes down to the fact that our mind is being clouded by our animal or base survival instincts. And so when we as women actually become truly nourished, when we start to nourish our bodies, provide our body the minerals that they need, get the rest that we need, really start to create a little bit more space in our lives, hold space for ourselves, our emotions, our feelings, and observe them in a more healthy way to shift our patterns of behavior, this interesting thing occurs where we start to actually see that things that we perceived to be opposites at one time are often actually 2 sides of the same coin and can often be both true at once. And it comes back to this idea of truth as a diamond. Everybody's looking at it from a different facet. It doesn't mean that because I see one facet, I'm wrong and you're right. And because you see a different facet, you're wrong and I'm right. It's understanding that, oh, there's a lot of similarities in this more than there are differences. The law of polarity refers to the fact that things that are opposites are 2 poles of the same thing. So for example, the example that's often used is love and hate, right? So hate is one side of the pole love is the other side of the pole. And they actually are the same thing, right? We cannot tell where love begins and hate ends. We can't tell where hate begins and love ends. Somewhere in the middle of the pole, you're going to find more things like dislike or being completely neutral and have zero feelings at all. But there's not a point in the scale where we can say, wow, hate has turned into love or love has turned into hate. And so the law of correspondence plays along with this, the idea that it's as above, so below, right? Oftentimes you can see corresponding things. We can use our body for an example of the law of correspondence. I can look at my skin and I can say, okay, this is an example of what's going on within me, right? As above, so below. So I can't see within me. I can't see my gut or I can't see the things that are going on within me, but I can see my skin and I can say, this is a reflection of another corresponding truth that I cannot see. And so these are two things that your mind starts to get open to when you start to expand, when you start to nourish, when you start to really support your body. And really, at the end of the day, it's about being able to use your imagination. I see this done effortlessly in children all of the time. Children have the mental flexibility to be able to just spot the natural patterns and the natural universal laws on their own. They don't need the names for it. They don't need the definitions for it. They don't need to be taught it. They're just naturally doing it because they haven't had their imaginations destroyed yet. And over time, we're told to face reality, to look at reality, to really almost unwire or rewire our brains to not think within vision and imagination and to think within what is in front of us is reality and that's what is and nothing else exists outside of that. This is the box I live within and there's no box outside of that. And so we have to keep in mind that when we begin to dive into more like esoteric teachings, that a lot of us have had our imaginations completely pummeled and destroyed. And it's unfortunate to me because I think about this a lot. As a little girl, as a young girl, and I'm sure you can relate, my imagination was out of control. I had worlds that I had built in my head. Like I lived on almost like a completely different planet than the one I was walking on. And I'm sure you felt the same. And at some point in your life, we were either told or shown how to not do that, how to go from being princesses and horseback riders and whatever our hearts desired to get a dose of reality. And I really think that as women, one of our powerful gifts is the gift of wisdom or imagination. That's really what wisdom is. It's imagination. It's seeking the things that are maybe not real or tangible right in front of you, but are just as tangible as the things you can see. It's about bringing beauty into the mundane. It's about bringing magic into the mundane. It's about bringing divinity into life that is otherwise gray. And so I really do believe that if we don't grasp this, we have a very difficult time getting into the headspace of being within our feminine energy. And I'm putting quotations about around that for those of you that are listening. This idea of getting into your feminine energy can seem extremely woo-woo or extremely esoteric or extremely intangible for those of us who have been trained to get outside of our imaginations and to live in the quote-unquote real world. And then we have people trying to almost create like these to-do lists and these checklists of like how to get into your feminine energy and how to bag a man with your feminine energy and how to use your feminine energy. And it further almost bastardizes divine feminine teachings into just something that you can just check off a list. Like you can just shake your hips when you walk and wear lingerie and you're in your feminine energy. And so not only is this like stressing women out because they're like wearing lingerie and shaking their hips and wearing their prairie dresses and baking their sourdough, then they're like, maybe I feel a little more feminine, but I don't really feel like I'm in my feminine energy. I'm still stressed out of my mind. And I'm actually feeling even more stressed because there's more things now that I need to do. And it's oftentimes when you don't grasp the depth and you're not able to use your imagination, not really able to like drop into it, it feels very surface level. It feels very achievement based. It honestly feels a bit fake Like, you just are like, okay, I'm just going to do this new cosplay and just put on this mask and put on this costume. And so then we start to equate it to good and bad. Being in our feminine energy. Am I being good enough at being in my feminine energy? Or am I in my masculine energy? We start to say, okay, being in my masculine is bad. Being in my feminine is good. Am I enough in my feminine energy? Am I not? It starts to become very dogmatic and stressful. And so many women are expressing to me that there's frustration here with these energetic principles. And no wonder, right? It's this dogma. It's another weight. It's another chain. It's another black and white, mentally inflexible viewpoint. There's no nuance. And this really starts to turn this very special and important law of the universe, the law of gender, which we'll dive into in just a moment, and denature the sacredness and starts to convince women that being feminine is really just like a cosplay, something that you can just turn on and you can turn off, right? You either are in your feminine or you're in your masculine. And how different is that from deceiving women into thinking that their fertility can be turned on and off like a light switch? It's crude oversimplification that can lead to a lot of damage and confusion. And I don't like the direction that it's heading. I think it's lame. And so I know that I have used the term getting into your feminine energy in the past, but as I move forward, I'm probably not going to refer to it as much that way because as I expand and as I continue to become more educated and just continue to contemplate, I recognize that paints a visual in our mind of a new thing that we have to do. Life should not feel like cosplay. It should not feel like we're playing a role in somebody else's story. And all of these teachings should really point you to rediscover who and what you already are. That's really the foundational thing. So I'm going to be a heretic. This is me being a heretic against the very weird, new agey, divine feminine, just feel good space. And really saying that getting into your feminine energy is actually impossible. You are feminine in nature. If you are a woman and you have female physiology, you are carrying feminine energy. And if you feel like you are stuck in your masculine, and I put quotes around that because we're going to expand on that and we're going to dive into that. It's time that we start to look at it a little bit differently. It's not about this idea of I got to get out of my masculine and into my feminine. It's actually more about I need to learn to accept all parts of myself and see that all parts of myself play a really important role and learn to integrate the masculine and the feminine together to do the dance and to healthily commingle as they should. It was really interesting to me, this festival that I was at last week. I had an amazing time. It was really amazing. But an observation, and this is just an observation that I made about a lot of the women that I met, was that what they perceived to be them being in their feminine or being in their like matriarch energy was actually extremely masculine. It was wounded, it was guarded, it was forceful. It was almost like, I'm going to declare that I am a matriarch, and this is what makes me a matriarch. There was not a lot of softness or ability to receive or capacity. It was very dysregulated feeling. And to me, that's the antithesis of true femininity. And this, of course, did not apply to all the women there. I just noticed it in a few kind of select group of women. But those same women really expressed being extremely depleted because it's not natural to hold yourself in that guarded, forceful place when you are in female physiology. And so going back to the universal law of gender that I mentioned earlier. Now, remember, when I'm saying the word gender, I know that this word is now very much like layered behind so many different meanings, and it's been almost hijacked in a way to mean something that it doesn't mean. We like to do that lately in our society. We like to hijack language and tell people what it means. But the word gender comes from the Latin word gene or Gene, which in the noun form, it means kind or species or characteristics. But The verb version actually comes from the Latin generare, same as like generation, and it means to produce, to beget, to engender, which means cause or give rise to, or to beget. It's the same root word of Genesis. It only very recently became used as a word to describe the sex of an individual, whereas before, because it was pulled from the root word genus or gene, it was really associated with more of the creation or the begetting of life, the beginning of something, to bring forth something, to beget something. And so if this triggers you, I'm sorry that history and facts trigger you. It must be a very difficult existence. This is just me pulling what the root and the origin of the word means. And so when I'm referring to the universal or hermetic law of the universe, the principle of gender, this is what we're talking about, this begetting. It is a law of creation. It's a creation principle. It's that you need two essences within this principle to create anything, to bring anything to fruition. This principle of gender applies. And this principle applies across many different layers of the universe. You can see it represented in nature, but you have to keep in mind that sex and gender are not the same thing. Our biological sex or our physiology are material representations of this principle in action, but it's not the only place where this principle exists. This principle, this balance, these two essences coming together to create or beget something are happening at many places within the universe, in nature, within the mind, within the spiritual planes. The only thing that is outside of this law is God itself. So God obviously doesn't have a biological sex, right? He does not have just one essence of the gender. The two essences within the creation principle, both masculine and feminine, are at work constantly for creation to occur. Both of these are essences of our creator or our source. Even though we love to apply humanity to God, God is so far out of our imaginings or knowings that we have to apply something to our creator to understand it a little bit. And so for many a millennia, we as humans have seen these essences or this principle at play. We often refer to God as our father, or we'll refer to Mother Nature. They are one and the same, but we're seeing these two parts of this principle at play where Father Son or Father God is this giver, and then the mother is the receiver and creates life from receiving. And it's been really interesting to me to see how much of modern religion has erased the feminine aspect of God from our consciousness. And we often think of God as this like authoritarian father that's going to come and destroy us and has all these rules and regulations for us. And if we make a misstep, he's going to like smite us dead. And we think of God as this just like overarching overlord father. And we've removed the feminine, nurturing, guiding essence from God, where God is beyond this. God is beyond gender. It shouldn't offend you or freak you out to refer to God as mother or Mother Nature, because God, even calling God a father, even calling God, is us applying human words or human understandings to something that is really unknowable. And so a lot of people get their panties in a wad when I say the word universe. And I have actually thought about this probably more than you have. The universe is a fruit of this principle of gender, this creation principle in action, right? The heart of God that is directing its energy towards something else, and that something else is receiving that and then taking that directed, forced, focused energy and receiving it and then expanding it, right? As represented in the sun is shining down on the earth, and then the earth takes it and grows and proliferates and creates life. And then that life goes in, applies this principle of gender, and creates more things. We're made in the image of our creator. What does it mean to be made in the image of our creator? We can create. We can't create from nothing as God can, but we can create from what is already created within the universe. That is our inheritance. That is our right. The universe is within God, There's a scripture that I memorized when I was a young child, and it always baffled me, and nobody ever had an answer. I asked everybody that I knew what it meant, and nobody told me. I remember people kept saying, "Oh, that's a good question. I don't really know." And it's the scripture that says, "Within him we live and move and have our being." And I always got really stumped because it was this idea that a lot of times creation is referred to and the universe is referred to as this thing that God has created from himself. It's separate from himself. But I never understood that because I was also taught that there's nothing that lives or exists outside of God. God is all. It's all things, right? There is nothing to break God up because there's nothing outside of God. And so this idea that God could take a part of himself and create something didn't make sense because you can't take away from God. You can't add to God. God is complete. God is everything. He's infinite. He's the Alpha and Omega. And it was always baffling to me because I felt like these things contradicted each other. And when I started to really contemplate these things and read a lot of the Hermetic teachings and some of the mystic teachings, and read some of the saints, the early Christian mystics, it became much more clear to me what this meant. This idea of within him we live and move and have our being. Many people believe that because really God cannot be taken away from or added to, God is complete in it of himself. The only way that he can really create the universe is within his own mind, and that we live within the mind of God, that the universe is an imagination of God, and he has gifted us free will within this area of his mind. And it's baffling. It's something that I continue to research and study. I'll never be able to understand the why behind what God has done, why this has been happened. Why did you do this, God? But Jesus came and said that it's all for love. Everything is for love. And so it makes sense that for whatever reason, I'm a creation that lives within God's mind right at this moment. And there's an intimacy in that as I continue to live and breathe and move, I am within the imagination of God. I am an imagination of him. I live and move and breathe because I am being imagined by this creator. It's baffling. And I bring this up because to understand the principle of gender, you do have to understand a little bit of what's at play to bring things into fruition. Everything that creates within the universe has to use this principle to bring anything to fruition. And so, this idea of masculine and feminine balance, right? There's really going back to the law of polarity, there's no definitive place where masculine energy ends and feminine energy begins. Now, of course, there's biological sex, right? There's female physiology and there's male physiology. Those are material expressions of this principle. However, energetically, on a more spiritual and mental level, it's not as black and white. It's more energetic, and there's a pull to it. There's an equilibrium to it, a balance to it. There's no definitive place energetically where I can say, okay, I just switched into my masculine. That was that moment right there where I crossed the barrier and went from feminine to masculine. Or I crossed the barrier and went to from masculine to feminine. So it's really about understanding more what the female physiology needs, that the female physiology and being regulated in your own body, your physical body, is a better marker of if you are in a place of what I call energetic equilibrium than just having these kind of arbitrary beliefs of like, I'm in my feminine energy or I'm in my masculine energy. To be comfortable within our female physiology, we really do have to embrace all sides of ourselves and be comfortable with being in our masculine. We need to learn to allow the masculine parts of ourselves to do their jobs, which is be provisional and protective, and allow the feminine parts of ourselves to receive that provision and protection and say, okay, I am now safe. Thank you for protecting me. Thank you for providing for me. I'm going to soften now. So it really actually comes down to creating a level of safety within your own physical body and not demonizing any part of yourself as bad. When we start to really understand that there is an ebb and flow to creation, and so when I say creation, bringing anything to fruition, that could be a child, that could be breast milk. That could be an idea for a company or a business. That could be a craft. That could be anything that you need to bring to fruition. Keep in mind that both essences, both the masculine and the feminine, need to play a role to bring something into existence. And you need to accept and soften to both sides. Each will play their role, and we know what those roles are. We've touched on this in episode 5, but I want to expand on that a little bit more. I used to describe the masculine as doing and the feminine as being. But as I've expanded my work and deepened this work, I really like to refer more to the masculine as doing or being and the feminine as becoming. So you think of the masculine as if you look at it as an upside down triangle, right? The masculine is really good at taking a lot of things, a lot of energy, and just a bunch of stuff and focusing it down to a very pointed period dot on the page, just a point. And if you look at feminine energy as the opposite of that, where we're really good at taking something very small and making it very large, that's a perfect example of the feminine. And the masculine wills all its energy in one direction, puts all its force of energy in one direction, inspired by the feminine, and the feminine takes it, receives it, and expands it, evolves it, grows it, changes it, vortexes it into something that could have never been imagined by the masculine, right? Because the masculine just provides, I think of it as the feminine is the blank page, the masculine shoots out a bunch of letters, and then the feminine takes all the letters and starts to form words and spaces and creates a story. And then the beauty and the imagination of that story inspires the masculine, and it wants to give the feminine again. And the cycle repeats itself over and over. And so we can apply these principles to just about everything. We have a masculine side of the brain and a feminine side of the brain. And when we start to understand this principle, it really opens our eyes to it's not about being only in our feminine or being only in our masculine, but understanding that each plays a role in bringing things to fruition. There's a time to will or act force onto something, and then there's a time to sit with it and allow it to become something different. And the will and force and action is that masculine aspect of the principle, and the holding space to receive that and to allow it time and space to become what it needs it to be, to evolve into what it needs to become, is that feminine aspect. It's the creation, generation, and regeneration process. It's the evolution or the salvation or the refining or the returning home back to which we came. The masculine is always giving to the feminine, and the feminine is growing back towards the masculine. We see this represented again with the earth. The sun shines down and everything grows towards the Father. The mother sings and expands towards the Father in response to the everlasting provision. And that is again, a beautiful representation of where we're headed, the direction that things are going. It's built in. All you have to do is open your eyes and see that we are returning home back to which we came, returning back to our source. We can rest easy in the universe, the mind of all that is, the mind of God. And so if you allow your masculine and your feminine to integrate and do their roles, you understand that you need that will and direction of the masculine. If you don't have it, you're not going to get anything done. You're just going to be like, oh, I'm just becoming and becoming. It's that blank page with all that potential, all that space, but nothing to co-create with. No raw materials, no resources. Or if you don't have the feminine, the masculine is going to feel real old really fast. You're just constantly directing your force and your will, your action, and you're constantly in this state of action and headed towards this goal and meeting this goal. And there's nothing really truly inspiring about it. There's nothing really romantic or beautiful or imaginative about it. It's just, it's this endless pursuit of something, looking for something to receive you. This emptiness that you can't quite put your finger on and will feel like a void over time, specifically for our female physiology, because our female physiology basic biological need is a sense of safety. And only the feminine can provide that true safety, that true comfort that is needed on a biological level. And so moving forward, we're going to refer to this as energetic equilibrium. And I'm going to use that term in my work. It's not about getting into your feminine or getting into your masculine, but it's really about integrating the two so that you can be fully integrated. And that's part of what healing is, true integration.
This episode is sponsored by Earth Runners. In the world we live in, it's apparent that we need to incorporate more simple, nature-based lifestyle practices and outsource less of our life to modern technology. Earth Runners is an ancestral-inspired sandal company which has created minimalist earthing sandals to support a more barefoot experience, both physically and electrically. An aspect of modern life that we don't often think about is how our shoes affect the ways in which we interact with the earth. Our ancestors were virtually always grounded. It's only since the advent of modern insulating soles that we have lost this connection. Earth Runners have a copper earthing plug and conductive laces to keep you grounded on the earth. They've taken the millennia-old footwear design known as the Huarache, which is a simple sole with a wrapping lace, one of the oldest designs in history, and upgraded it with the Vibram soles and earthing technology to give you the most minimalist, natural, and grounded shoe experience you've ever had. Earthing is crucial for regulating your circadian rhythm, which affects hormone production and timing, quality of sleep, mood, inflammation, and more. I've personally been wearing Earth Runners as my main shoe since about 2019, and I love the minimalist sole for a healthy full range of foot movement, which has improved everything in my biomechanics upstream. Wearing these have strengthened my feet and legs in ways I didn't even know I needed. Use coupon code NOURISHED for 10% off at earthrunners.com.
And so when we talk about action steps to this, I hope that I know some of this might feel very woo or very out there. I don't know where you individually are at. I know especially when we're locked down and our masculine is very much just in this very rigid protective mode. We almost have a shield up. And our feminine is so undernourished and just crying out for something. It's a part of ourself that is just so undernourished and so underfed that she's almost silent. And I think this is why as a culture we're leaning more towards I love these trends like soft girl era and cozy cardio, all in fun. It really shows us that we desperately crave this use of imagination and bringing beauty into our lives. And we're really sick of just relying so heavily on the masculine parts of ourselves and just feeling that emptiness, that soul deep hunger, that cell deep hunger that I talk about. But when we're talking about actual action steps, when we're talking about what this looks like on a physical level or on a daily level, it really comes down to one thing. When you possess female physiology, which most of you are women, so if you're a woman, you have female physiology, it really comes down to that your basic biological need is safety, right? It's safety, stability, and security. And from this place, now it doesn't mean that we always need to be only in our safe, cozy cocoon and it's all about comfort all of the time, right? That's not what I'm saying. But it's that we need to learn how to create a sense of safety and stability within, because that is what's going to make us resilient in times of stress or in times of pressure or in times where we might be thrown off our equilibrium. We have a safe place within us. We have equilibrium within us that we've created. And this really comes down to becoming deeply resourced from within. So nourishment is a huge part of resources, right? When you provide your physical body with the raw materials and resources it needs to feel a sense of safety, it gets out of a state of famine. It gets out of a state of constant scarcity, which most women are living in that state. They're living in a state of fight or flight, constantly stressed out of their mind and not having the resources to rise up and meet that stress. That is where we start to get out of this energetic equilibrium. And so we start to pull from our survival instincts instead of pulling from a place of peace or calm. And this affects the way that we're using resources, right? We drop into a use of a lot of energy. So when we jump into fight or flight, we're burning through our resources faster than we can intake them. And then over time, we can't maintain that any longer. And so we start to drop into a place where we actually begin to conserve our resources. And neither of these states are healthy long term. None of us need to be in this like low grade state of constant hypervigilance all the time. But we as women are wired to constantly scan our environment for safety. And unfortunately, within the environments that we live in, we can pick up a lot of signals of danger if we're not very careful and we don't have a lot of control and power over our own minds. And so, really, becoming properly resourced is two things: providing our body with the raw materials and resources, which is why nourishment, this idea of nourishing our bodies, has become so popular, right? Making sure we're getting enough calories, making sure we're providing our body with enough protein, with enough carbohydrate, enough fat, replenishing micronutrients, minerals, making sure the fluids in our body are carrying the nourishment throughout our body. This is why some people are starting to focus more on lymphatic health. And we focus on pulse rate and body temperature because the fluids in our body bring nutrients to our cells and provide cellular nourishment. Making sure that we're moving in a mindful way, right? We're not overtraining, but also we're not undertraining, because that can also lead us to have that feeling of we're conserving all these resources, we're nourishing. We're not actually using any of those resources in a healthy way. We're only using resources in an unhealthy way, like when we get stressed out or when we're doing something that we don't like to be doing. So it's the management of resources. It's not just the intake of resources, it's the management of resources. And that kind of leads me to the other aspect of it, which is maintaining and using our resources appropriately. We are meant to face challenges. We are meant to rise up and reach challenges. That's how we expand. It's how we grow. But for female physiology, it's done in a little bit different way, and it always has to be viewed through the lens of safety. Because if you are in a place where you are constantly in a state of chronic hypervigilance, under-resourced, you don't have the raw materials, you don't have the things necessary to provide that sense of safety, you're stuck in a state of famine or scarcity, then if all you're doing is just focusing on the use of resources and you're just putting demands and challenges on top of a body that's already unsafe, it's going to feel like an implosion over time. Because instead of being able to rise up and meet the challenge, your body has the resilience and the nourishment to expand and grow. It's just going to collapse you over time or burn you out or deplete you. And so that is going to be very dependent on how resourced you are, how resourced from within you are. The more work you've done in nourishing your body, making sure you're eating enough, making sure you're balancing your blood sugar, making sure you're exercising, making sure you're sleeping, making sure you're getting the sun that you need. And I don't look at this as like this long to-do list. I like to look at these as mothering ourselves. Mothers, I call this era of time within the collective of women the great remothering, because this is the era of the mother returning to herself. Really, when you meet your basic biological needs, you're doing really important sacred work because you're rewiring your patterns of safety. What does a mother do with a newborn baby? She feeds it, she holds it, she coos it, she loves it, she cuddles it. It's just basic, right? It's just like, this infant is completely reliant on me, and so I just provided its basic biological needs. As that safety grows into something more and more, over time, the needs change. And that's the same way that we need to approach ourself and our health. If we feel like we're not properly resourced from within, we got to start with mothering ourselves, and we got to go back to the basics, treating ourselves as if we are a newborn baby. And as we become nourished, as we become more regulated, then we expand, right? And our needs will begin to shift and change and grow. And because we are mothering ourselves, we're looking for those signals. We're able to start to see, okay, the needs are shifting, and so I'm going to rise up and meet those needs. And it can be very difficult work. It's the most important work we could ever do and that we ever will do. And you can look to nature for examples of this, right? Just like a mama bird first just nourishes her children, nourishes her little babies, lets them just chill out in the nest and chirp and just brings them food and regurgitates it back into their mouth. Eventually, they get big enough to where she says, all right, it's time, and she kicks them out of the nest. And they have to learn to fly. And there does come a point where we've created enough safety in our body that then we can start to rise up and meet some challenges. It's time to start to repattern our behaviors. It's time to give ourselves a little bit of that tough love and face our deepest, darkest shadows, the parts of ourselves that are really scary to face. these things that we talked about today, these truths that are being brought to light. Once we have a sense of safety from within, we start to get to a point where we're resourced enough to start to expand our minds, to start to explore our belief systems, to start to dive deep into the patterns that we carry from our childhood, to do the nervous system work, to do the deep work, the deep cellular soul work that is so important. But a lot of people flip-flop this and start trying to do that spiritual work, that soul work, and nervous system work, the talk therapy, all of those things, but they can't change. They don't have the energy to shift on a cellular level. It starts with creating a sense of safety first within the cells. And that's really what Fully Nourished is about. This is what my work is about. This is what my nutrition work is about. It's about this idea of we need to have the proper resources in order on a physical level to be able to expand on a mental and spiritual level. And until we get there, it's going to feel like all of this stuff is very esoteric, intangible, unreachable, very hard, very difficult, or possibly even something that we don't even understand, that we barely connect to. But there's something deep inside of us that's, I want more of that. I'm not sure what that is, but I want it. And it's okay. Just follow that still small voice. But remember that the first step is really just loving yourself, remothering yourself in the best way you possibly can, and making that your ultimate goal. Treat yourself, if you need to start from scratch, this idea of you can be born again, this idea of you have to go back to the beginning and almost like rebirth yourself in a way and repattern all the things that have been hardwired into your physiology that are telling you're deeply unsafe. You now need to rewire and say, I am safe, by making it a point to provide yourself with your basic biological needs, which is nourishment, acceptance, love, kindness, all of the things that we need to grow. And if you can't do it alone, that's understandable. That means you're human, right? This is why we rely heavily on our community. This is why we rely heavily on other like-minded women. This is why it's important to seek out mentors. And this is why it's so important to really sit down and really wrestle with what you believe about your higher power. Do you really believe that you are alone in all of this? Do you really believe that there's just some guy in the sky out there that doesn't really care about you? Do you really just want to shut yourself off and harden yourself off to the idea of a higher power? That is going to absolutely affect you on a physiological level, because it's going to impact your sense of safety, your sense of belonging in the world, your sense of self. If you're looking for any of the links or resources discussed today, they're included in the show notes, which are linked in the description box below. If you enjoyed the episode and want to support the podcast, I'd love if you could share it with others, share about it on social media, or like this video, subscribe to the channel, or leave a review on any of the major platforms. I really rely on the amazing women in our community to spread the word, and I also really value your ideas and your thoughts and your feedback and your questions about the podcast. So if you have any topics you'd like discussed or any guests you'd like me to bring on, please go ahead and use that link in the description box to submit those to me. And if you want more content, please sign up for my Sunday email at jessicaashwellness.com/email-subscribe. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you soon.